The activation switch was warm under my palm, smooth metal, slightly vibrating with the hum of the quantum field generators.
All readings nominal. Field strength at 97%. You're clear to proceed.
I pressed the switch. The lab disappeared. Not gradually, not with warning. One instant, fluorescent lights, the smell of ozone and coffee, the soft whir of cooling fans. The next, sunlight so bright it burned, air thick with wood smoke and sewage, stone rough under my stumbling feet. Rome, ancient Rome. The acrid smell of human waste and burning charcoal slammed into my lungs like a fist. The disorientation hit like a physical blow. My knees buckled.
I caught myself against a wall, rough stone, sun-warmed, real. Too real.
The sun beat down from a different angle, the shadows falling wrong. The air tasted of smoke and sewage and something else, something organic and overwhelming. Voices shouted in a language I recognized from textbooks but couldn't grasp. The words flying past too fast, the accent all wrong. I jumped back. The driver didn't even glance at me. My hands were shaking. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat too loud, too fast. This wasn't possible. Quantum displacement was theoretical. The math said it couldn't happen. The physics said... But I was here. The stone was warm under my palm. The smell was real. The cart was real. I left behind everything. My partner of 5 years, who would never know what happened to me. My parents, who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if I was alive or dead. My sister's wedding next month. I was supposed to be her best man. The half-finished paper on my desk, the equations I'd been working through. The cat who would wait by the door for me to come home, who would never understand why I didn't. The grief hit me in waves those first minutes, sharp, physical, crushing. My throat closed, my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to collapse, to wake up from this impossible nightmare. But grief was a luxury I couldn't afford, not yet. Not when I was standing in what appeared to be ancient Rome, with no idea how I'd gotten here, or how to get back. And wasn't that just perfect? I'd spent 3 years building a machine to test quantum entanglement, and instead of proving a theorem, I'd become the universe's most elaborate, practical joke. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so completely, utterly terrifying. My second coherent thought, after the panic subsided enough to think at all, was about language. I'd studied Latin for 6 years, 2 in undergrad, 4 more in graduate school when I realized where my research might lead. I could read Caesar and Cicero, parse complex grammatical structures, decline nouns through 05 cases. But academic Latin and street Latin were different beasts entirely. The conversations swirling around me were rapid fire, full of slang and contractions I'd never encountered in texts. The accent was wrong, harsher, more guttural than the carefully reconstructed pronunciation I'd learned. The vowels flattened, the consonants sharper. I knew the word for republic, but not workshop. I could discuss Stoic philosophy, but not negotiate for food. I could recite Virgil, but not ask where to find water. I caught fragments. Imperator Trajanus, Forum, Denarii. Enough to orient myself in time and place, but not enough to function, not enough to survive.
Non me!
A woman shouted something at me, angry, urgent, her face red.
I stared at her blankly, my mouth opening, but no words coming. Was I standing in the wrong place, blocking her path? I still didn't understand.
She spat on the ground near my feet, the sound wet and contemptuous, and walked away muttering what were probably curses. A man laughed, others stared. I was deaf and mute in a world where communication would be everything.
I needed help. I needed a teacher, a translator, someone who could bridge the gap between my academic Latin and a living language of Rome. Without that, I was helpless. Worse than helpless, I was invisible, incomprehensible, a ghost who couldn't even ask for directions. I forced myself to observe, to think like a scientist, even as panic clawed at my throat. The architecture, the clothing, the level of technology, everything pointed to ancient Rome. The year was harder to determine, but the mention of Imperator Trajanus suggested around 100 CE during Trajan's reign. The height of Roman power, the empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. 1 million people crowded this city, the largest urban center on Earth. The sun's position told me it was late summer, high in the sky, but beginning its descent toward autumn. The heat was oppressive, the kind that made stone radiate warmth even in shadow. I had arrived in the afternoon, perhaps the 8th or 9th hour by Roman reckoning. The streets were busy but not crowded. The midday rest period had ended and people were returning to work before the evening meal. And I was completely, utterly alone. I patted my pockets instinctively. No phone, no wallet, no tools, just the clothes on my back, modern clothes that would mark me as foreign, strange, possibly dangerous, and the knowledge in my head. That knowledge, physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, engineering, was my only asset. It was also potentially the most valuable thing in this world, if I could figure out how to apply it, if I could survive long enough to matter. At first, I had to survive the next hour, the next day, the next week. I had no mission, no grand plan, no choice in being here. I was stranded, 19 centuries before I was born, with no way home that I could imagine. The question wasn't, what should I do? The question was, how do I stay alive? I had knowledge, scientific principles that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. I understood thermodynamics, electromagnetism, germ theory, atomic structure. I knew why things worked, not just that they worked. I could identify materials and predict their properties. I could look at a rock and know if it might contain iron ore. I could test clay and estimate its firing temperature. I could design tools and processes that didn't exist yet. I could sketch a steam engine, a telegraph, a microscope. I could write down chemical formulas, mathematical equations, engineering specifications, if I could find someone who could understand them. I could teach. This might be my most valuable skill, if I could overcome the language barrier. I could explain why boiling water prevented disease, even without showing anyone a bacterium. I could demonstrate how to measure precisely, even without modern instruments. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. I couldn't create materials that didn't exist in nature. No plastics, no synthetic rubber, no modern alloys until I built the capability to make them.
I was limited to what ancient Rome had access to: clay, wood, stone, naturally occurring metals, plant and animal products. I couldn't skip steps.
I needed fire before I could make ceramics. I needed ceramics before I could make crucibles. I needed crucibles before I could smelt metals. Every capability had to be built on previous capabilities.
I couldn't work alone.
I would need craftspeople, laborers, merchants, patrons. I would need to navigate Roman social structures, economic systems, and political realities.
I couldn't rush.
Kilns took days to fire. Metals took hours to smelt. Crops took months to grow. Buildings took years to construct.
I couldn't afford to make mistakes.
The technologies I might build could kill me. Fire burned. Molten metal exploded if it contacted water. Chemical fumes poisoned. High-pressure steam ruptured vessels.
I had no safety net, no hospital, no way to call for help.
One serious mistake and I was dead.
Should I even try to change this world? The question haunted me from the first moment of clarity.
I hadn't chosen to be here. I hadn't asked for this responsibility. But I had knowledge that could reshape history, and I had to decide what to do with it.
Every technology could be weaponized.
I knew this from history, my history, their future. Better metallurgy made better swords before it made better plows.
Chemistry made explosives before it made fertilizers.
Precision manufacturing made firearms before it made clocks. The same knowledge that purified water could create poison gas. The same engines that powered tractors could power tanks.
If I taught these things, I couldn't control how they'd be used.
Knowledge, once released, couldn't be recalled. I could try to shape how it spread, try to delay certain developments, try to establish norms against misuse, but I couldn't guarantee anything.
I could focus on technologies that improved life,
Clean water, medicine, agriculture, communication. I could try to build foundations of prosperity before anyone thought about tools of war.
but I was naive if I thought I could keep the two separate.
I would face pressure to weaponize my knowledge. Patrons would ask for better weapons. Military leaders would demand innovations. I would have to navigate these requests without any real power, without any protection except what I could negotiate. The norms I created now would shape how future generations used these tools. Every choice I made would ripple forward through centuries. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. But I couldn't think about it now. Not standing in this street, not with my hands still shaking, not with the immediate problem of survival pressing down on me. These questions would have to wait. First, I needed to live long enough to face them. Rome wasn't just a setting. It was a complex society with its own rules, power structures, and cultural norms. My survival depended on understanding these, even if I couldn't speak the language yet.
Rome was hierarchical, and that hierarchy was rigid.
I could see it in how people moved through the streets,
The wealthy in their togas, carried in litters by slaves who sweated under the weight.
the citizens in their tunics stepping aside for their betters, the slaves themselves, eyes down, invisible and less needed. At the top, the emperor, Trajan, from what I'd gathered, senators, old aristocratic families with vast wealth and political power, and equestrians, wealthy businessmen who controlled much of the economy. In the middle, citizens with legal rights and political voice, freedmen, former slaves who'd earned or bought freedom, and skilled craftspeople who formed the backbone of the economy.
At the bottom, slaves,
Perhaps a third of Rome's population with no rights and no hope. I saw them everywhere in those first hours. A woman carrying water, her back bent under the weight of the amphora. A man hauling stone, his hands bleeding. Children. Gods, there were children, following their masters, their faces blank. The entire economy depended on their exploitation, and I would have to confront this. Soon. The thought made me sick.
This structure wasn't just unfair.
It was inefficient. Slavery wasted human potential. Rigid hierarchy stifled innovation. Aristocratic privilege blocked merit. But I couldn't simply denounce it. I was an outsider with no power, no legal standing, no protection. Direct confrontation would get me killed or exiled.
If I survived long enough to matter, I could try to work within the structure while subtly undermining its worst aspects. Hire freedmen and pay them well. Teach anyone willing to learn regardless of social class. Create opportunities for advancement based on skill, not birth. But that was thinking too far ahead.
First, I needed to survive the next day. Rome ran on patronage. A complex web of mutual obligations between patrons and clients. Wealthy patrons funded projects, provided protection, and opened doors. In exchange, clients provided loyalty, support, and prestige. This wasn't charity. It was investment in social capital.
I would need a patron eventually, someone with resources who believed in whatever vision I could articulate.
This was non-negotiable. Without a patron, I couldn't secure workspace, buy materials, or hire workers. Without protection, I was vulnerable to theft, violence, or legal harassment. But how could I find a patron when I couldn't even speak the language? How could I explain what I knew, what I could do, what I could offer? How could I negotiate terms when I couldn't understand the conversation? The language barrier wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Every day I spent unable to communicate was a day I couldn't earn money, couldn't find shelter, couldn't establish any kind of security. Roman law was sophisticated but complex. Property rights existed and were generally respected, but they weren't absolute. Contracts were enforceable, but enforcement depended on social status and connections. Guilds controlled many trades, and they didn't welcome outsiders or innovations that threatened their monopolies. I would need to navigate these systems eventually. But first, I needed to understand them. And for that, I needed someone who could explain them to me in a language I could understand. Everything came back to language. I couldn't negotiate with patrons. I couldn't hire workers. I couldn't buy materials. I couldn't explain what I knew or what I could do. I couldn't navigate legal systems or social structures. I couldn't teach or learn or communicate in any meaningful way. My 6 years of academic Latin were worse than useless. They gave me just enough understanding to know how much I was missing. I could recognize words but not understand sentences. I could read inscriptions but not follow conversations. I could pass grammar but not communicate meaning. I needed a teacher, not just someone who spoke Latin. Everyone here spoke Latin. I needed someone who spoke Latin and could also understand me. Someone educated enough to bridge the gap between my modern knowledge and ancient language. Someone patient enough to teach a desperate foreigner who could barely string together a coherent sentence. Because without language, I had nothing, I was nothing. Just a confused foreigner in strange clothes, standing on a Roman street, completely and utterly alone.